Hi, everyone. Michael Cavacini here. And today I have the pleasure of interviewing David Livermore. David is an accomplished author, leading authority on cultural intelligence, and much more. And he has a new book that just came out today, which I'm very excited to speak with him about. That book is Digital, Diverse, and Divided: How to Talk to Racists, Compete with Robots, and Overcome Polarization. That is a very impressive thing to accomplish and a hefty order. But David has tackled this in his newest book, which just came out today. So, David, welcome and congratulations on your book that just came out today.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar with your work, I know, you've authored other books, but just explain to people kind of your background, what you've written about before, and what inspired you to write Digital, Diverse, and Divided.
Yeah, thank you. So those two questions are linked together. Um, my work for the last 25 years has been focused very much on something that we call cultural intelligence. So many of your audience will be familiar with IQ. Almost everybody is familiar with IQ, a measurement of our book smarts, cognitive abilities. Many will also be very familiar with this notion of emotional intelligence. How well can we regulate and monitor our own emotional state and those of others? Cultural intelligence picks up on that same body of research and measures to what degree can you be effective working with people from different cultural backgrounds. So my work and my previous books were really focused on what we might typically think of in so-called cross-cultural relationships, interactions. How do guys that look like David and Michael interact with counterparts who might be sitting in Dubai or in China? And partway into that, maybe 10 years or so ago, we started to focus more on the diversity, equity, and inclusion areas, where I know you've also spent some work in law firms and other places, and looked at, hey, this cultural intelligence skill can help with diversity within the US or within Canada or within Germany or Australia, etc. All of that brings me to this book, as I've just been a citizen of the US and of the globe, and have watched over the last 6 or 7 years what feels like increased polarization everywhere we look. It struck me, and then it put me on a quest to find out if it was true that our research actually had relevance not only to people who hold a different passport than you, but also maybe to someone who looks very much like you on the outside, may even be someone who's in your extended family, but who couldn't have a more different view than you on politics or vaccines or any number of other sensitive issues. So that's kind of the crux of my work, has been in helping people develop intercultural skills. And suddenly now this new book kind of says, and the cultures that you're trying to divide may be the ones across the street from you or in the cubicle next door.
Yeah, very fascinating. And over these past few years of COVID, I find that we've become more reliant on technology to communicate with each other, which means it kind of widens the net with the people we're connecting with in different time zones, different countries. I know in several places where I've been employed, I've been dealing with people, across the country and across the globe, which means you may be interacting with people who have a different cultural background or norms, or even celebrate different holidays than you. So, how do you think that has affected the need for what it is you're addressing in this book?
Yeah, I mean that's actually what the digital of the title is trying to get at, is acknowledging that we all have to do cross-cultural work now. And I would say, you know this well, but I'd say there's a kernel of what you said that was certainly true pre-COVID. Like, I was often interacting with global teams in the Midwest who might say, I'm never getting to travel on the company's dime overseas, but I'm expected to get on a call at 10 o'clock at night with Asia, whatever. But to your point, I think it suddenly became the norm in COVID that we're all suddenly interacting. And maybe what's been different about it in terms of COVID is almost all of our interactions now are forced through virtual, at least they were for a period of time. And then alongside of that, we had moments like the George Floyd murder and other political polarizing events that happened. And so suddenly now I'm jumping on a call with someone where this news has just come out, and do I talk about this? Do I not talk about it? I know this is a big deal in the US, or is this even on the radar in the Philippines? So, yeah, I think it's just exacerbated the challenges that come with it. And yeah, to keep it simple, to your point, it's just suddenly that you don't have to even have a passport suddenly to be engaged in international conversations at work or interpersonally.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, diversity is an interesting topic because I think on the superficial level, sometimes people think of it just as black and white. And then when you really dig down deep, you kind of realize that, oh, gender equity can be part of that. Even having a disability can make you part of a diverse community. I mean, speak to that and just kind of the different layers and subtleties when it comes to diversity.
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts that I had when you raised that, Michael. First, while it's only indirectly related to what you said, but I think is important for me to point out for those who haven't read the book, I do acknowledge right at the get-go, and perhaps annoyingly so, continue to acknowledge that I'm a white, middle-aged straight guy, and I am very aware that that will make some skeptical of why they should even read a book from me on diversity. And frankly, I'm not defensive to that pushback. I think people are right to go, wait, really? But two thoughts on that. One is, I think there's something for people like me to do in regards to this conversation. I shouldn't abdicate all responsibility because, well, this doesn't affect me. On the other hand, I always do so with an awareness that I don't have the same level of lived experience. I mean, I step into most situations and I'm among the privileged group. That said, to your more important point, I think, is what I really tried to do in the book, and of course I'm not alone in this, others have done as well, is to really broaden the definition of diversity, which doesn't need to undermine the black-white challenges and the anti-racist conversation that has gone on, but also says, hey, there are some very real invisible forms of diversity that can often be overlooked. And you mentioned disability. Sometimes disabilities are visible, sometimes they're not visible at all. Sexual orientation, gender identity may be visible, they might not be. Age, profession, socioeconomic, and at the risk of making diversity everything, where suddenly it's like, your name's Michael, my name's Dave. See, we're diverse right here. Like, there has to be some kind of difference in the values and norms before I would link it to diversity. But I think diversity needs a much more inclusive, broad definition if we're really going to do the work that allows us to actually bring about equity and inclusion, which is, as you noted, is really what DEI, as it's abbreviated, is really trying to promote.
Absolutely. And you're right about uh, sometimes people like ourselves uh, who benefit from, I guess, status quo, if you will, white privilege and all of that, will think, oh, how can I, who am I to take part in diversity stuff? Like I can, almost like they're like a fake. But that's not just people who are directly affected by these situations matter, but also allies, right? People who are potentially in positions of power, if you will, saying, hey, like, for example, when I worked for a previous organization, the person who's at the head of the company, if they're the one who's saying, hey, DEI efforts are important to us, well, that's good, because then that means, it's coming from the top. It's not just coming from the bottom. And that can have a big effect. But something I find that's really tricky is language. I'm a communications professional, so anytime something is worded a certain way that doesn't resonate with everyone, I always question, well, maybe it's the way maybe it's the language. Like defund the police sounds negative, so that's why a lot of people push back against it. White privilege sounds like you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, so a lot of white people will be like, oh no, I had to work for what I have. So I mean, let's talk about white privilege for a minute, just to how would you explain to someone who doesn't understand it, and how would you overcome those barriers to people just accepting that it is a thing?
Well, first off, I think you're right that sometimes we're needlessly creating barriers with language. And, some in the DEI world would immediately say, "Oh no, are you worried about making a white person uncomfortable or a straight person?" Like, no, but I'm also very aware that people like you and me, and we don't know each other well yet, Michael, so I'm making assumptions about you that may not be fair. But at least individuals like myself, I can opt out of the conversation anytime I want. So why not find ways to get me engaged in it rather than immediately putting my hands up and go, fine, you think I'm privileged, I'll just take my balls and go home. That said, of course, there's reason why we need to be pushed to feel uncomfortable. Back to the privilege. So I prefer to think of privilege as existing on a spectrum. And, kind of the classic definitions are any time that I gain something that I never did really earn or work for that just kind of benefits me. And I purposely try and approach this P word in the book by using an example in Singapore rather than using an example in the US to try and talk about, hey, it's not always necessarily white privilege. Like in Singapore, the Chinese subpopulation tends to be much more privileged than the Malay or Indian. But regardless, there's an aversion to that in Singapore as well, to suddenly say it, because it can very much be the same argument of, well, it's because we work hard, it's because of our efficiency and productivity. And so I guess it's stepping back to ask, are there some subtle things that I benefit from that others don't? So let me try and be more concrete here. I have two daughters, 23 and 25, biological children to my wife and me. So they're white, cisgendered, straight women, and they have worked hard for the degrees that they have pursued and the grades that they have gotten. I'll be the first one to applaud them, etc. I didn't have the bumper sticker on my car, etc. But I was and am a proud dad. But there were so subtle ways that I greased the wheels for them in different things, and this will sound almost like nonsensical to people or the other extreme, like so privileged, but I've done quite a bit of work with Qatar Airways through our work in cultural intelligence. One of my daughters going to be flying Qatar when she was on a study abroad trip, and I just emailed some of my friends. They're like, hey, my daughter's going to be on one of your flights, hope you can look out for her. They didn't upgrade her to first class, but they gave her very special treatment because we had a relationship. Though she did nothing to earn that, but it gave her a little different level of experience flying than she would have had if I hadn't had that connection. So I think that's what we're trying to get at with privilege, is nobody's saying you didn't work hard or you didn't make some sacrifices, etc. But might there be some things that you just took for granted that you get just by nature of being part of the system? I don't know. I could dig myself into a really bad hole here, because there's part of me that wonders, though, if the privilege thing it's kind of like critical race theory, right? Like, if there's so much baggage with the language now, do we just need to recast it and talk about it in a different way? Just one final thing. I'm going on way too long here, Michael, but just one thing that occurred to me. Like, one of the things I wrestle with personally, and I expose some of this in the book, is an African-American professional who's broken through some of the ceilings that prevent their opportunities and has gone to an Ivy League institution, has gotten a professional job. Are they more or less privileged than somebody who is white but living in poverty and hasn't been able to break out of the cycle of poverty and is still, living in subsidized housing and such? Which one of these is privileged? I'd say that both of them have disadvantages that the other one doesn't have, but who am I? I'm not going to say to the disadvantaged white person, do you realize how privileged you are, etc. So that's why I come back to saying I prefer to see it more on a spectrum. That professional individual I just talked about, if you compare them with me, they lack some of the privileges that I have. If you compare them with somebody who's in a very different level of economic development or education, then maybe it looks a little different. So I'm just furthering your point that the language itself is both important, but also can sometimes get us really, really stalled and trapped into places where we don't know where to go with it.
Yeah, agreed. In critical race theory, I love that you brought that up. Because I remember I was literally, I think, last year at Thanksgiving, and there was someone across the table from me, and the person said, "Oh, they're just trying to blame white people for this and that." And And they're teaching kids that being white is bad, and I'm like, that's not really what it is. And I explained what it actually is, and my dad just tried to like shut me down because I guess he figured like it's not worth it. Like, like I get that you're right, but like let's not have an argument about this, during the holiday. But yeah, it's just they accept whatever definition they're given by some sort of biased media source, and then that forever in their head is what it is, which is unfortunate. My example for white privilege is my first job was working as a cashier at a grocery store. I remember I interviewed for it. I only got the interview because my dad knew he knew the guy who worked at the butcher. So that's how I got the interview. I went in for the interview and they're like, "You come highly recommended." I'm like, "I've never had a job in my life. What am I recommended for?" And I worked there through high school, college, part of grad school, and eventually it became too much to do all those things at once, and I just quit. But I remember at one point I would always go to work. I'd like do my hair, wear cologne, like be presentable because I never knew who I'd ring up. Maybe someone who could have hire me or something. And I remember one time someone came in and they walked up to me and they're like, "You're the manager, right?" And
Wow.
I said, "No." And they walked past everyone else to me because they figured,
Yeah.
okay, based on his appearance, he must run this place.
Yeah.
And I was just like, wow, like right there. I mean, that's white privilege, right? It's people making assumptions about you purely based on your appearance. Like if I were walking down the street, no one would necessarily cross the street and be like, he looks dangerous. I'm afraid of him. I mean, it doesn't matter that I'm 6'1". They're not going to be afraid of me, but they might be afraid of someone who's shorter than me, who's black, wearing a
Right.
hoodie, right? So it's a
Right.
whole different situation where we just and I think I remember someone described white privilege as like being a fish in water. If you're a fish in water, you're not aware of the water because it surrounds you. So it's hard for you to comprehend that it's there because it's always there. It's like no different than oxygen. It's sustaining you. You just don't necessarily always think about it.
Mm.
Yeah, it's just really interesting stuff. And the critical race theory is another fascinating and polarizing topic. Now, you broke up this book into three sections. You have Why Can't We Just Get Along? Building a More Culturally Intelligent World, and CQ Solutions for Polarized Worlds. Uh, kind of walk me through that the structure of the book, because I mean, this is a big topic that you're really addressing in this book. So why did you decide to structure this book the way you did, and what were you hoping to kind of achieve with each of these sections?
Yeah. So the first section, I thought it was important to just lay down some of the foundational issues and where I expect some critique and pushback, and I certainly welcome that. I have to be able to engage in diverse thoughts myself in putting a book out like this. But where some might give me some pushback is I actually start the Why Can't We All Get Along with saying, hey, like 99.9% of the DNA of all of us as human beings is the same. And so the young black male with wearing a hoodie versus you walking down the street, same DNA. So why should there be any difference that's assumed based upon that? But then I quickly pivot in that and say, but because of these social worlds that we all grow up in, we've been primed to think that, oh, if you have a Black Lives Matter sign in your yard, or if you're saying defund the police, that automatically means X, Y, Z, etc. And so I kind of am trying to get people to live in tension with all lives do matter. There's a kernel of truth that's good in that, and Black Lives Matter, and can we live with those coexisting together? So where I said I anticipate some pushback is actually, I think because I start right out with, actually we're closer than we appear, I think some people might think that maybe I'm arguing for a colorblind approach, like you should just see everybody the same, which of course is impossible because our bias immediately causes us to view young Michael working at the grocery store differently than somebody who looks, different in terms of their appearance. So that's kind of the first, trying to set the stage and assure people, like, I'm here to focus on what we can do in common. And then also to say, Michael, and if Michael had a twin brought up in the same home, you have different personalities. So how do we look at on one end of the spectrum, what we all have in common to the other? extreme. The building a more culturally intelligent world part, that is really, so at the beginning of this conversation, you asked me just to share a little bit about my background and my work. This was my attempt to make our scholarly research on cultural intelligence really accessible to people to go, so what is it? Like, tell me briefly, what's cultural intelligence and how do I apply this at Thanksgiving dinner? And how do I apply this at work? If somebody is, repeatedly missing deadlines, am I just supposed to say, oh, that's a cultural thing, or is there any way I can resolve it? So the part two is really trying to say in super practical language, what does cultural intelligence mean? The final part is really trying to just give lots of examples of where I find our polarization seems to live most. And so I do address the topic of race a bit sheepishly, coming in saying, I didn't know if it was my place to write this chapter because I'm aware that I'm a white guy, but how do I write a book about diversity and polarization, not address race? Talk about religion, a very polarizing issue. A couple times in our conversation today, we've talked about politics, and I talk about that. So it tries to give lots of stories and very practical examples of what does it actually look like to navigate a conversation with someone who has a very different view than you on reproductive rights, or should the federal government be forgiving $10,000 a loan? I mean, pick the week in the news and you've got a place that you can be applying this. So by no means am I suggesting that that third part is exhaustive, but it tries to give a lot of concrete examples of what does it actually look like for us to coexist and realize we're never going to all agree on these things. And actually, not only is that okay, that's actually positive if we know how to use the differences to help us build a more, solution-oriented world together.
Yeah, you're right. It is really interesting that there's always something to polarize people, and the student loan thing is the latest. I had student loans. I don't know if your daughters or you had them, but some people say, "Oh, I had to pay for my way through school, so why should someone else get special treatment?" And then another person said, "Well, just because I had to suffer doesn't mean everyone else going forward should have to suffer." And to take it to a further extreme, you could even say, like, if a black person was a slave, why would they want uh, uh, their
Mm-hmm.
descendants to also be slaves? They would never want that. They would say, "I'm fighting for my children to have a better life. I don't want them to, I want them to have freedom. I want them to have independence. I want them to have agency, of voice, and just as much power as the person at the top of the org chart." So yeah, it's just really interesting.
Yeah,
Just
and
how these things can separate us. And I like that you're trying to bring us together and say, no, no, no,
yeah,
no.
sorry for interrupting you. I was just going to
Yeah.
say to that point, like, I actually think there's a worthy debate to be had of, and is whacking off 10,000 and, growing the deficit or whatever, the best way to get at it. But let's focus on the problem of how inaccessible higher education is and ways to address it, rather than just, oh, you're a heartless person who doesn't think they should benefit, or you're just ready to give everybody a handout. And it's the same thing when you mention defund the police or critical race theory. Like, we're not getting to real solutions because immediately it's like, wait, who said that? Okay, then I disagree with it, instead of, yeah, there's clearly a problem here with higher education. So, and I mean, easy for me to say. I mean, Washington, it doesn't seem to be able to do that themselves, with very different parties that have different perspectives on it. But anyway, I'm waiting way beyond my pay grade to know how politics should actually play itself out. But at least at the grassroots level, can we temper some of our screaming and shouting about it?
Yeah. And something that's very challenging to overcome too is we're in this era where you have, Me Too, cancel culture, things like that. And while it is, I feel like we live in a world of extremes. Obviously, it's important to hold people accountable and for there to be consequences for their actions, especially if they're um, deplorable actions. However, how do we make sure we're not writing off someone who we think is, they're a lost cause, right? Like, let's say it's like lots of times people like to say, oh, this generation boomers, oh, okay, boomer, right? Like, oh, we can't convince them about this, they're too old. Or the older people saying, oh, they're too young. So how do we kind of have compassion for one another to the point to realize, wait a minute, we could actually figure this out together?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple thoughts on that. One, it's one of the reasons I start the book with this whole reference to the Human Genome Project that said 99.9 of our percent of our DNA is the same. Like if I think of who's the most polar opposite individual to me and I stop and look at them as a fellow human being, I'm not saying it takes it all away, but it can help temper it, as you said, at least start with a position of compassion and more gracious understanding. Um, Shoot, I just lost where I was going to go on the second point related to. Oh, yeah. Another thing that I think is really key, actually, an emerging finding from our research on cultural intelligence from the very beginning is the number one thing that predicts whether or not someone's culturally intelligent is their openness, their curiosity. So, whether we're talking about a polarizing topic or whether we're talking about working together with a Chinese person, and you nailed it. Like, sometimes our work in diversity is perpetuating the polarization because we're saying the boomers are going to more than likely act this way, the Germans are going to act this way, your female colleagues think this, the millennial. Which one are we talking about? So how do we actually get beyond that broad swipe to have a level of openness? And, lest I sound like I have all the answers, I mean, I've sometimes assumed someone isn't open because of their communication style. Maybe they're very passionate and like shouting and, a loud volume. And I'm like, forget that. And might have somebody else who seems very conciliatory, but they're actually just baiting me and waiting to use what I'm going to say. So I think part of that finding out, can we find some common ground at least to begin conversation, is we have to do a little bit more discipline, look at figuring out what does it even mean to know whether someone's open. Do they have a communication style that's different than yours, or are they genuinely closed to anything you're doing? And rather than speaking in generalities, just a simple question that I'll often insert in those conversations is, would you be open to considering a different perspective on this? And rarely will someone say, hell no, like, well, I'm at least willing to consider it, etc. So at least kind of primes them to, I don't want to argue with you, just that there are people who have a different view on this, right? So can we at least start with that and then interact about those different perspectives?
Yeah. Um, and then what's the most, I mean, you've obviously done lots of research, not just for this book, but for just your work in general and other books that you've written in the past. Anything as you were writing this or researching to write it, where you went, wow, I did not expect that. Like anything that kind of surprised you, considering you've been doing this for so long.
Yeah, there's a couple, but the first one that came to mind, it was more in the writing process than the research. So as a lot of authors do, I circulated an early version of the manuscript to a very diverse group of readers who wanted their raw feedback. The subtitle that you mentioned starts with "How to Talk to Racists." And what surprised me was the feedback. I expected some people who look like me to go, oh, really, we're going to label a whole group of people racist. And I deal with that in the book and say, I'm not saying one political party is all racist or whatever. But what surprised me was a number of people of color who said, I feel like the very subtitle itself presumes on me that I have to talk to a racist. And am I obligated to talk to racists? Like, do I have to take that on? Like, wait. I never meant to imply that this is now everybody's obligation, and all the more so if you're constantly on the receiving end of microaggressions or discrimination or bias, etc. So I didn't expect that, because I just kind of figured, well, the people who are picking up this book are someone who are like, I just want some help in navigating this conversation. But it caused me to be much more explicit in the revision to say, this is an opt-in experience. And particularly if you are on the receiving end of discrimination, you have my utmost respect if you're one who says, I just can't take that on right now. I can't like suddenly engage in debating with someone who thinks I have the same level of privilege they do. So I think that's one that's really kind of stick with me, to be mindful that my little, marketing quip subtitle, "How to Talk to Racists," like, oh, kind of back to your point, but words matter, and they hit people differently based upon their own context and what they read into that.
And do you think now is a harder time or an easier time to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion? I mean, compared to different decades, I mean, the civil rights movement and everything in between now and then. I mean, do you think it's harder or easier?
So I do think if we define this as more than race, I think, and research backs me up, that at least in the US, we're more polarized than we've ever been in history. So in that way, harder. For sure, like we've made huge progress in civil rights and even issues related to race, and I think even post George Floyd, like I've heard a lot of people saying, oh, it was all optics, that the companies were making commitments to DEI, now they're all walking away. I saw a report over the weekend put up by McKinsey that, again, it's self-reported by companies, but actually doesn't support that a bunch of companies are walking away, shows ongoing investment and growth. So in that way, I'm encouraged. I think, even when I started this work 20 years ago, if you were a very global company, you were talking about diversity. If you were a small to mid-size, like, well, we don't do global work, we're really not engaged in it. And I think today it's kind of expected, everybody has to do it. So that was a very kind of both and answer to you. Like, of course, I think overall, the fact that here you and I are two white guys that are very well versed in this conversation, and most people we talk to in the workplace would have some familiarity with it. But because, like you made comment of earlier in the interview, because of intersectionality or the many different cultural spheres that we all walk in, I worry that we've just replaced one other for another. And I just heard somebody say last week, we can't get to inclusion if we just decide that anti-racist has to mean anti-white or anti-whatever, anti-person of privilege. We have to somehow find a way to navigate that.
Mm. And two things popped into my head. For companies, like you said, of all different sizes, why does diversity, equity, and inclusion matter from a vendor standpoint and also from a recruiting standpoint?
So vendor meaning the suppliers that a company does business with, their vendors?
Yeah, and the reason why I mentioned this, I kind of already know the answer, but I know that some vendors actually require proof of DEI
Right,
being a part of your company, and you need to actually show that,
right.
oh, we have X percentage of leadership or minorities or women or things like that. So I mean,
Yeah,
you know, I guess tell me about that shift where
right,
it's like not just enough to write a check anymore. You actually need to show that, hey,
right.
internally we're doing things, but and just to even work with them, you need to prove it. And then from a recruiting standpoint, trying to recruit these younger generations, almost like environmentalism, how important is it to demonstrate that you're taking DEI seriously, whether you're a small company or Comcast?
Yeah. So to the vendor supplier diversity, I mean, part of it is a matter of true equity and justice. If there's, and I believe there is, if there's some merit to the privilege conversation, if you're just continually doing business with other people who look like the dominant culture yourself, you're just exchanging the money back and forth. We'll hire you, and then you come and do business with us, etc. And I think there's a more concrete business need for this as well, and I'll get to that also with the hiring. That I'm going to have a supplier that's ill equipped to support us if they don't have any diversity in their own mix. And I even found this, I led the Cultural Intelligence Center for 11 years, small business ourselves, and we would talk to website vendors and say, to what degree are you going to help us with the design? Do you have diversity yourselves? And, well, we don't, but we have cognitive diversity or something like. But wait, we're a global company. We have to make sure that you've thought through the design, navigation, colors, etc., based upon our audience. So it made us susceptible to not. So it was more than just like, we're going to make a statement. We genuinely believed it. I think that's true for the hiring as well. Like, you're genuinely going to better understand your diverse customer base. But to your point, I think if I read where you were going, I think there's also, in the midst of the quiet quitting and unionization and great resignation, there's also, particularly in Gen Z and millennials, who are like, if you're not committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I don't even want to have another follow-up conversation with you. Like, this is just kind of like basic management 101 that you've thought it through. So we've looked a lot at, does age predict whether or not you're culturally intelligent? And it doesn't. You could be a boomer and be just as culturally intelligent as someone who's a millennial, and vice versa. But definitely millennials and younger espouse a much higher value for diversity, equity, inclusion, and skills like cultural intelligence. So I think there's a whole issue of, attracting and retaining top talent where there's just an expectation that you're serious about this and you know what it means beyond just putting out a social media post when another tragedy happens.
Mm. And you mentioned quiet quitting. That's something that's getting a ton of attention right now.
Yeah.
It's all over the place, and it's just a fascinating term. Uh,
Bad term, I think, right? Like
well, yeah,
defined
it's true
briefly.
because when you really look into what it means, it's not really quitting. It's just saying
Right.
that you're not agreeing to this. You basically are just doing. You're saying I'm going to do what's expected of me and nothing more.
Exactly.
But how do you think there's overlap between that and DEI? Do you think some people are saying I'm only going to do what's expected of me and nothing more because the
Yeah.
company I work for doesn't show that dedication to DEI efforts? I mean, what do you think there's any influence there?
I do, and I think it's another thing that's really been um, further amplified because of COVID, where people were like, "Look, I suddenly realized the last 2.5 years what really matters to me: meaningful work, equity." And so I'm actually seeing equitable compensation for the work that's expected as language that's often used with quiet quitting. And furthermore, when you see that often the more junior positions are where you see greater levels of diversity than you do at the top ends of the company. So I think there's at least a correlation here between DEI and the quiet quitting. Um, for me, like I would say, one of the challenges is both on the employee side and the employers is we have to exercise some of these same skills that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes is to what degree can we actually take on the other one's perspective? Because, an employee does have to understand there are very real limitations to what a company can pay and very real needs of what they have to deliver. But particularly in a labor market that we're in right now, employees ignore to their peril the fact that employees feel empowered. And yeah, I think it at least has some overlap with the DEI of we expect you to take seriously that we expect to be compensated equitably and we're going to have a life outside of this place.
So the two most difficult audiences I would think that you'd have to convince to read your book are audiences who say either, "Oh, I already know all this DEI stuff. I got that down," or people who say, "Ah, I don't need to bother with that. Who cares about that? That doesn't affect me." So if you had to talk to both those audiences and say, "No, no, no, you really should consider reading this book," what would you say to them?
To the DEI group, I would acknowledge, yeah, there's a lot of the fundamentals of DEI that you're going to see brought up here. What I hope this adds to the DEI conversation is one, that it takes a much more global approach to DEI rather than just a US centric. And that's something that I've heard often from individuals that are frustrated with what they see in a lot of DEI. So I gave the example of I actually approach privilege through a Singapore case study rather than a US based one. And the other thing I would say to the DEI professional is it's really focused on knowing how to navigate these rather than knowing what the information is. So it's a very much a how to, without being like 3 simple steps to very difficult things, but what do you actually do to structure a conversation around this? To the individual who's like, it's not for me, I mean, if they're really convinced they have nobody with a diverse opinion that they want to engage in conversation with, I'd probably say, you're right, it might not be for you. But I would at least ask them, so, do you have anyone in your world that has a different view than you about gender fluidity or politics or whatever? And if they would say, well, yeah, if that's what you mean by diversity, well, then give it a chance. Like, see if this gives you some tools. And, bear with me. You'll see some of my own perspective come through that you don't disagree with, but I'm not about trying to convince you to have my view on these topics. It's more about, do you have some handles around which to engage with it? So it just, maybe I'm too much of a utopian idealist, but it grieves me to talk to so many friends who have stopped talking to family members because of the views they have on Trump or whatever else. I'm like, is it really worth? And sometimes it is. Sometimes people are like, it's too triggering. I don't go to Thanksgiving anymore. And I'd be like, but I don't want you to regret someday that you broke off relationship with some of the most important people in your world, at least make sure you've done that consciously rather than just assume that the person who disagrees with you is a bigot, instead of, might there be a way that we could actually navigate this without having to fully walk away agreeing on it?
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I saw that myself with the election, lots of, and myself included, there are some people who I unfriended who I reconnected with because I even told them, I even addressed it. I said, listen, politicians really don't care about us. They're just out for themselves. So why would I let that come between a friendship? If
Mm,
I already liked you as a person prior to this, what's the purpose? It's not like the politician doesn't even know either of us personally. So why would we get so caught up in that and let that ruin something? It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
yeah.
And I know it's easier said than done because people get very uh, wrapped up and invested in a lot of these things. So it's understandable. But and I would argue that your book, like you said, you don't have all the answers. But if you get people to talk, if this book gets people to discuss, to come together, just to even just ask questions, to create that discourse, well, then it's doing something worthwhile. Because if we're
Mm,
not talking together and we're just talking at each other or separately, we're not accomplishing anything. But if this
mm,
can at least bring people together and have a conversation, um, whether it be in their personal life or their professional life, then it's well worth it.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. We nobody gains anything by just staying in our echo chambers and refusing to dialogue. And to take that a step further, rather than just having difficult conversations about difficult topics, like, and then maybe can we actually use our different views on this to come up with better solutions? It was my big disappointment with COVID. I mean, the big disappointment was the loss of life, but aside from that, I thought surely this is a topic that can unify us, a crisis that can unify us. You can't blame any one side for having made it happen. And there's a debate to be had on individual rights about vaccines versus the collective good. Let's have that debate instead of turning it into such toxic rhetoric of, you only care about yourself, or you want socialist medicine. And so yeah, I appreciate that word. Like, how do we talk and orient around, there's got to be a solution we can work through together.
Absolutely. So, anything else you'd like to share as it relates to the book, or any other exciting things you have going on, or just anything you want people to know as it relates to this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I will say I'm still an optimist at heart. I've had times myself, even in the writing of this book and interacting with some of my own network, like you, that I'm like, ah, forget it. But I have been pleasantly surprised that people on very different sides of political issues, because so much of it ends up being political, are looking for what it is we have in common. So I would say I'm hopeful. I think there are ways that my book and many other resources alongside of it can help us not just take this as our forever state, but we got to, at the grassroots, take ownership for it. We got to quit thinking we're going to vote into office the person who's going to make it happen, because we've seen that we're just as polarized today as we were 2.5 years ago, and we were then as we were today. So, but I would encourage your audience to have a hope-filled thought on what it looks like for us to live together in this digital diverse world.
Exactly right. We can't, like you said, or to kind of build on what you were saying, we can't just elect people and hope that they'll save us. We need to save ourselves, and that all starts by working together and talking together to find those solutions to these difficult problems. Um, Fantastic. Well, thank you, David. For anyone who's watching this, please visit David's website, davidlivermore.com. His book, Digital Diverse and Divided: How to Talk to Racists, Compete with Robots, and Overcome Polarization, is now available. Today is the first day it's available, so you can jump onto Amazon. There's a link down below for you to click so you can grab a copy for yourself. And David, am I correct that it's available in print, ebook, and audiobook?
Yes, it is.
And audiobook, did you narrate it or did someone else narrate
I did. So that may have just hurt my sales now that people have listened to me, like, oh, I have to listen to this guy for 5 hours. But yes, I did the audio.
That's awesome. Actually, I love audiobooks. I listen to Audible every day. So listen to script, and I'm just for those who haven't given audiobooks a chance, this is actually a great opportunity because I think when you have the author narrate their own book, it's as if you're having a conversation with David as we are right here. So I encourage you to, check out the audiobook version as well. And I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it as I have reading the ebook. So David, thank you for your time. Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
Michael.
It's been a fantastic discussion and best of luck with the book and everything else.
Thanks so much.